Hi everyone, my name is Erkki Veltheim and today I'm going to mainly be talking about improvisation. I'm an improviser, composer, violinist, violist and kind of all-round performer myself. Improvisation really is a way of making music. It's not a type of music or a genre. You can improvise in many different ways. So I'm going to be touching on some of those ways today. But maybe to start with, I'll talk a little bit about myself and how I became a musician. I was born in Finland in 1976, all those years ago. I moved to Australia when I was 12 in 1989. I started playing the violin when I was 7 and continued that throughout my life. I switched to viola when I was 17 and then played both viola and violin for a while and then gradually moved back to the violin. In fact, the reason I moved back to the violin after playing viola was partly to do with my improvising career becoming more and more prevalent over my interpreting kind of career or practice. So I studied mainly performing through my high school and university years, but I was always interested in composition as well from my teens. And I think through that I naturally started trying different sounds on the violin and the viola, exploring different possibilities, which kind of was a natural introduction to improvisation. I then studied improvisation a bit more formally with a composer and violinist called Jon Rodgers in Brisbane, and then started playing with various kinds of improvisers from all kinds of musical backgrounds, from jazz and rock and noise music, all these different kinds of music which I might explain a bit more detail. So improvisation as a way of playing, a way of making music, really was at the heart of classical tradition in the Baroque and classical eras. So in the 17th and 18th centuries. Even Mendelssohn, all the way through to the 19th century, was a great organ improviser. After that, improvisation became less and less part of that classical tradition. And I think it's only been in the latter part of 20th century that both composers and instrumentalists in that tradition have started to incorporate that kind of playing into the Western musical language again, or the Western classical music tradition, or art music, however one calls it. Of course, improvisation is an integral part of traditions like jazz and country, blues, lots of different folk musics around the world, as well as things like noise music, which is really music that deals more with the colors and textures of sound rather than melody and harmony. Now, what is improvisation? It's really a way of composing in the moment. It's a bit like what I'm doing today. I don't have a whiteboard or a PowerPoint presentation or notes in front of me. I've got my violin, I've got a bit of blue tack, more on that later, and just my thought process that will hopefully take me through this class. Of course, I know roughly what I'm going to say, just like an improviser knows or has a language through which they speak, but I don't know exactly what words I'm going to use and in what order. So really, like if playing notated music is a bit like reading a script, playing improvised music is more like having a vocabulary, but responding to the moment. So what happens in the moment? There's a lot of things, for instance, in this room, which will affect the way I play. There's a set of gongs here that resonate quite nicely. You may not be able to hear them, but it gives me ideas about how I might react to that in this space. Also, the acoustic of every space is different. The people around in that space are different. I might feel different. So the way I then compose my music in that present moment will be different every time. It doesn't mean that I can't have ideas beforehand or practice improvisation. Of course, you can practice improvisation, and one should if one wants to improvise with any kind of integrity or with a broad palette of ideas. So improvising is not just making up in the moment. It's more that you've prepared certain vocabulary, and then you put those words together or those ideas together in the moment, depending on how things react to that, to your playing. Of course, it's also different if you play with other people. It means that you're more in a dialogue where you interact with those people that you're playing with. When you're improvising as a soloist or a solo performer, of course, you're only reacting to yourself and the acoustics around you. Now, in practices like jazz or in musical styles such as jazz or country, often the improvising is done as solos. So the lead horn player might take a solo, the violinist, fiddle player might take a solo. And traditionally the classical style or in those kinds of music is that you solo over a chord progression, for instance, the chorus of the song. So really you're extemporizing a melody over a given harmonic frame. So extemporizing really means doing something in the moment. It's very much the same as improvising as a word. So a jazz soloist will take that harmony, which may also be use substitutions and different harmonies to the lead sheet, to the standard version of the song, so that the soloist and the rhythm section, so to speak, will interact and improvise together on that form. So there's in that kind of classical jazz or country and western or blues, there's a very set given form within which you make your own musical statements. In things like Baroque music or classical music, when I say classical, I mean the classical era, so Mozart, Scarlatti, Beethoven. Soloists often would be called to improvise a cadenza. So cadenza is really in a classical concerto is the main form of improvisation in that tradition. In the Baroque era, people were called to improvise, especially if they were playing what's called the basso continuo. So they would get a bass line and the harmonies that go with that bass line, and would have to extemporize again. The word extemporize a harmony part that might use different forms of voice leading and counterpoint. So different voices against each other. So really they're very specialized, the Baroque and the classical and the jazz, country and western blues, they're very specialized forms of improvisation where you have a quite a fixed form within which you extemporize. Now, in the 20th century, a lot of composers in the second half of the century, 1950s onwards especially, became interested in what's known as indeterminism or aleatoric music. So what these words mean are that you compose in a way where you leave certain parameters of the music, certain elements of the music open to the interpreter. Again, these are very much, they call on the performer to improvise, in a very specific context. In a context of a pre-composed work where certain things have been left open. So some composers might leave things like, they might give the interpreter, the performer, a set of pitches that the performer can use, but can use in their own rhythm, in their own time, and in their own combinations. Again, very fixed or limited kind of improvisation. But of course, you do have to, as an interpreter of that kind of music, you do have to understand how improvisation works and how you can build musical statements out of more open materials than, for instance, notation that will give you both the rhythm and the pitch, dynamics, expression markings, etc. Arguably, in every piece of music, whether it's fully notated or not, the interpreter will need to use their musical judgment to improvise certain things, certain elements, the expression, the phrasing of that music in order for it to be convincing. So there are many benefits to understanding how improvisation works for many kinds of music. Of course, also for composers, myself being an improviser and a composer, I know very well that understanding improvisation makes my composition practice much richer. It's a way to get ideas, it's a way to test ideas. There are ideas which can have different contexts, such as improvisation and fully notated composition as their outcomes. So for me, improvisation really has been an integral part of my overall musical practice, and has enriched all of my musical life to a great degree. Whether I'm playing Bach, Beethoven, Xenakis, my own pieces by Anthony Pateras, colleagues of mine, improvising with people like Scott Tinkler, great jazz trumpeter. It gives me a lot more choices in all those musical areas. So I would encourage everyone to at least understand the principles of improvisation, because they will give you a lot more ideas about how to play your instruments, play different kinds of music, and hopefully also compose your own.